Well, so to segue from 1600s to now, it's really not that hard to bridge the two because we're still talking about 16 words. Okay? And the 16 words, I think, are applicable to everyone and all situations, but they, of course, have a special impact on people teaching in public schools. I think they have a different kind of impact on people teaching in private schools, but still an important impact. So we want to get into all that, and I hope that you will engage in any of these questions you want to as we go along. I'm not waiting for me to stop talking if you have questions as we go along. I just want to highlight, I mentioned earlier what the 16 words are. Isn't it remarkable when you think about it that our religious liberty provisions of the First Amendment are only 16 words and a bunch of lawyers wrote it? You think about that. Ask them to do that today. It would be like this. That's right. This would be it. But actually, this was before the days of billable hours. So. No, it's remarkable in its brevity. And there's so much that goes into understanding how those 16 words came to be, which we won't get into. But I think for public education, it's very important to stop and think about that history behind just 16 words. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which really shapes everything we do in our public schools. And in many ways, shapes everything we do in our private schools in a larger sense because we wouldn't have private religious schools except for these 16 words. And that's literally the case. One of the early fights was, of course, about whether or not people had the right to send their children to a private or religious school. And it's really thanks to these 16 words that they do. And the Supreme Court decided that parents do have that right. And our whole society is shaped by this framework that we're given, no establishment and free exercise. So let's think a little bit about those as we get into the school arena. I would say, linking back to this morning, that these are two principles for one freedom. That's how I read it. So no establishment, free exercise. This is not the only view of how to think about these principles, because clearly you can argue that no establishment is a limitation on government, but is not a fundamental human right. There's one justice on the Supreme Court today who actually doesn't think, who has questions about whether the Establishment Clause should really apply to the states for this reason. You know who that is? Good guess. One justice. You're a ringer. I'm going to ask you.
I'm not a ringer.
Here's like these students you have, answer every question. So say, you can't answer. No, you're right. Justice Clarence Thomas believes this. So two principles, I would argue, for one freedom. But Roger Williams in me wants to say that really, unless we have both of these conditions, we don't have religious freedom. I think this is true for Jefferson and for Madison as well. But those who voted for the First Amendment in the first place, when they voted, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, they could have been voting to keep Connecticut and Massachusetts establishment. Corey and I were talking about it earlier. Because when the First Amendment was adopted, there were still some established churches, and there was no single establishment. So certainly the First Amendment wasn't speaking to whether, like Chief Justice Rehnquist said, whether there should be a single establishment or not, because there were only multiple establishments when the First Amendment was drafted and passed. But the two holdouts in Connecticut and Massachusetts, if you were representing them in the Congress and you voted for no establishment, or for Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment, to use the actual language, you could have been voting, Congress can't make any law having to do with our establishment. We get to keep it. They don't have any power over it. So that's why it was compromised language. You could vote for it if you wanted states to have the right to establish religion. You could vote for it if you thought that, as Madison did, that any establishment was a violation of conscience. He tried to get this more as a federal, application of rights of conscience to the states. He failed. So that's why, for the first part of our history, the First Amendment doesn't really interfere with what schools do in this arena. There are no school cases under the First Amendment in the 19th century, into the 20th century. Zero. Do you all remember your high school civics, or maybe you teach it? So why is it, so maybe you do remember? Why? It's summer, but you still might remember. So why is it that we have the First Amendment now does apply to the states? This is one of those important terms in American history that we kind of overlook. All of our First Amendment cases in public schools now are not really First Amendment cases. What are they? Yeah, they're 14th Amendment cases. And so most Americans don't realize that it's the 14th Amendment that gives us First Amendment protection in the states, and not the First Amendment. Although they're all called First Amendment cases, but all these prayer cases and everything else are really through the 14th Amendment. So Congress shall make no law, though does signal right away that government, you can just substitute government now for Congress since the 14th Amendment, as the Supreme Court decided, applies it to all levels of government through the 14th. So government shall make no law respecting an establishment. Right away signals that there is what follows are fundamental rights that cannot be taken away or given by government. Government's role is to protect the rights that follow that language. Congress shall make no law. Government's role is to protect those 5 freedoms that are in the First Amendment, not to give them. They're assumed. So they're inalienable rights. Why do I say all this in the beginning? If a parent comes in and says, I don't want my child to read this story. And some of you are literature, folks in literature. And of course, some of you are in elementary school. So this is part of the course in elementary school. I don't want my child reading whatever story that offends their faith. Whether or not that works out for the parent or not, how much accommodation you can give is a conversation we can have. But one thing we should start with, that's a claim of conscience. And it's an inalienable right. I think in the 21st century, we've lost sight of how fundamental that is to our arrangement of freedom. Claims of conscience now are somehow, because of the culture wars, I think, somehow are seen as somehow something that we can't really accommodate, we can't take seriously. But frankly, the framers thought that it was our first liberty. If you don't have freedom of conscience, what good is free speech? Think about that. Or free press. If you're not free, what Jefferson called freedom of the mind, he starts the Virginia statute for disestablishment of religion, when it was passed, it started, whereas God Almighty hath created the mind free. Everything else follows. So unless you start with that, then you don't have any rights whatsoever, unless you're free to follow your conscience. You're free to have this, to do what you feel your God requires, or your conscience requires. It doesn't matter if you have free speech. So when that parent comes in, you may think this is just some sort of strange or wacky request. Why don't they want to read The Wizard of Oz, for God's sakes? What's wrong with that? Or, what's their problem with, Halloween party is just, ghosts and goblins, whatever the issue is. That's a claim of conscience. And I would argue that unless we take that very, very seriously, I'm not saying what the outcome should be, because that's a different issue, but we first, I think the first thing we say when somebody comes in and complains about, my kid can't read this story because of our religion, but I saw that you were signing this. I think the first response should be, what a great parent you are. You actually read what we sent home. And you care. I wish I had a whole classroom of parents like you. Rather than, what are you doing here? This is what I've assigned. This is, everybody has to read this. You would do that. There are people who get very defensive about this and don't want to see that parent come in the door with that religious claim or whatever it is. But actually, it is true. They are very deeply concerned and involved people. And they care about conscience. So they wouldn't be there. They're not there because they just don't like the story, usually. They're there because they feel their conscience is at stake. It's not the way I would understand my conscience, but that's not the point. In our arrangement, in our public schools, we are there to protect conscience. We're not there to decide what consciences are right or wrong, in my view. So that's, I think, the starting point for this whole conversation. If we really want to take religion seriously in public schools, or take teaching about religion seriously, we have to start by taking freedom of conscience seriously. And that really shapes everything we do when it comes to dealing with religious views or non-religious views among our students and our parents. So we've had a bad history in dealing with this in the United States, as you know, right? We've had a bad history. And I think that poisons the well for us when we try to get this right in public schools. I actually think many public schools are getting it closer to right now than ever before. That's the optimist in me. I think we still have some challenges and some issues which we'll talk about, I hope. But I think we're closer than we ever have been to getting this right. However, the bad history still hurts us. And when I say bad history, I want to rehearse all that history, because I think you all know it as well as I do. But we had a long period of time, in summary, where we had one religion that really was the established religion of the school. Now, that is not as pernicious as it sounds, because actually the religious diversity at our founding was great, as many of you know who teach this stuff. And coming to agreement across those differences among different Protestant approaches to Christianity was a major achievement. And public schools were founded out of that achievement of finding that common faith, if you will, to borrow from Dewey for a second. Or Horace Mann, was a great achievement. So the fact that there were de facto Protestant schools was actually seen as an expansive, protection for all kinds of diverse consciences. Isn't that interesting? Today we think of it as this monolithic, Protestants dominating. Actually, Protestants were so diverse and divided and in each other's throats that it was remarkable. It was a miracle. They didn't anticipate, of course, that common ground, if you will, would fall apart as immigration brought in waves of Jews and Catholics. They didn't anticipate, and they reacted badly in many cases, but they had achieved something they thought would keep the society glued together. When the Protestants gave up establishment, they did not imagine, I think, that it would end in losing the kind of society or culture It reflected their deepest values and their understanding of our society, dependence on God. They didn't anticipate it. They just assumed. There was anxiety at the founding about this. In fact, so much so that Alexander Hamilton, who's now famous, he used to talk about Alexander Hamilton, and people go, who's that? What did he do? I mean, it's amazing. He's gotten this moment. But Hamilton actually tried, before his life was short, he tried to set up a kind of Christian coalition of his day. Because one of the anxieties he had and others was that unless we organize some way of ensuring that this constitutional arrangement remained Christian in flavor and in ethos and so forth, the society would fall apart. So even though there was no established church, there would be some way to set up these chapters around the country that would encourage kind of Christian culture in this constitutional arrangement. Isn't that interesting? So he anticipated some of the same anxieties that happened to us in the culture wars of the 80s and 90s. So there's always been that anxiety, but nevertheless, the schools reflected that Protestant consensus and the reading of the Bible without comment. You know, Protestants could all agree on that, right? Because that's how Protestants read the Bible in a sense. It's a direct thing, you know. I mean, for Roman Catholics, that was completely wrong-headed. The prayers, you know, again, consensus on that. Reading the King James Version of the Bible, reading from that, there was consensus on that. That was the true Word of God. He apparently spoke the King's English. And he still does. So all of that was a strong agreement. And that pervaded the school. Now the irony of this is, of course, well, there are a number of ironies. As you know, there was great revolt against some of this, particularly Roman Catholics, as they were numerous. Out of conscience, they could not send their kids to a Protestant school, or what they saw as a Protestant school. Sit there and listen to the King James Version of the Bible. If you read the introduction originally to the King James Version, it says some nasty things about the Lord. So they're going to sit there and read out of this Protestant version of the Bible, which is not their Bible. Right? And this is their public school. So there was early on revolt, as you know, there were riots about this issue, which Bible was going to be read. Convents were burned over this. It was a very difficult time. So this history shaped schooling in some profound ways. One of the most profound has to do with what you're here for, this institute, is the high irony of when did religion leave the curriculum? And who got it out? Well, the short answer is the same people who want it back in. Of course, they want it back in a certain way, but they'll take what they can get. Folks who are concerned about the secularization of the curriculum, so they'll accept teaching about religion plural because that's the best they can hope for. But in the late 19th century, many Protestants actually worked hard to keep religion out of the curriculum. And of course, they would, because in many neighborhoods, in many neighborhood schools, if the curriculum was decided by the school board and the local people, what would be taught in the curriculum?
Whatever the dominant.
Yeah, papacy, right? Anti-Christian teachings, heretical teachings that undermines religious freedom, undermines the Constitution by an insidious force that's invading our country and corrupting our country. This was widely believed to be true. And to keep that from happening, best to have no religion teachings in the curriculum. So the irony is that the very people who complain about the secular curriculum today, for all these years, were the people who got it out in the first place. Now, to be fair, a lot of that was in the curriculum was pretty much New Testament passages that you learn to read by reciting the Sermon on the Mount or whatever. So And the few Jews in the schools just had to sit and take it. They did complain in New York in the early 19th century. They petitioned and said, you know, we should not be we have textbooks with the New Testament. You know, these are public schools, and the school officials in New York thought, gee, what do we do with this? So they set up a committee to look into this. They said, what is this? So they set up a committee. The committee came back with a report, and I kid you not. I mean, they were so blind. They just had no idea about this complaint. And the report said, we really examined the textbooks, and we see nothing to complain about except for the fact that they teach the truth of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, what's to complain about? I mean, they were sincere. They just didn't get it. What? We're just teaching the truth about Jesus. I mean, gee, what do you do in schools if you don't do that? And so this is our history. Those vestiges of that history are with us in a lot of the conflicts that we face in many schools around the country on these issues. More recent history has been on the other side of the pole. If that was the sacred public school, that you could say in shorthand, and Warren and I use the same term, and the naked public school is when all religion is excluded. You know, separation of church and state. It's a completely misbegotten notion about separation of church and state, but nevertheless, for various reasons, it took root in many school districts. I think a lot of it was fear of controversy. Because if the Supreme Court decisions were read by many, meaning if you deal with religion, you're going to get in trouble. It's volatile. They may have even thought the court intended to keep it out. I don't see how you could read those court decisions and come back to me. But it was so politicized, and nobody bothered to read the decisions themselves, that people assumed that the path of least resistance is just to keep religion out. So a lot of public schools today still are, in that part of our history, they're still stuck there. And you still have these strange examples of kids being told they can't bring their scriptures to school, or things like that. We can't say grace together at the table, things like that. And that is a bad history too. And the textbooks, until very recently, pretty much were silent about religion. So this is what we come to when we start talking about religion in schools now. We come to this kind of difficult place. So what is really the First Amendment school? We know kind of what the sacred school looks like, and we know what the naked one looks like. And these are the models that many parents come with when they come to public school. They sort of have this history. They may not know it very well, but they kind of have in their mind that either the school is promoting religion or the school is hostile to their religion. So the goal of what we should be doing now, and I think many schools are trying to do, is what does it look like under the First Amendment? So why don't we look at that and work on that during our time together? Because I think that's what you're interested in. And I think whether you're in a religious school, private or independent school, or a public school, it matters how we deal with religion, not only constitutionally, it also matters for the future of the country, how we're going to deal with one another, how we deal with our religious differences. And I don't think any school represented here today is monolithic in religion. I mean, there's religious diversity everywhere. So religious schools have to deal with this as well. They may not have the same legal ground rules as a public school, but they certainly have a civic mandate to deal with the differences in the school. So let's break down then a little bit what a First Amendment school would look like. What does it look like? What do these ground rules mean for the schools, particularly public schools, that we can segue to private religious schools as we go along? I think the mega point to make about private religious schools, just so we don't neglect it in our conversation about public schools, is again, the First Amendment really protects the right of private and religious schools to be what they are. So think about that. Government cannot tell a Roman Catholic school how to teach its history class. That's a huge achievement. And that's not true in many other places. When government funds the Catholic schools in Germany, I can tell you what, government has a say in what they do. As we say in Washington, the shekels come, shekels. So, in the United States, religious schools are given autonomy in many respects, not complete, but in many respects because of the First Amendment. So you wouldn't even be talking about any of these issues in religious private schools because they wouldn't be able to exist or be autonomous if it weren't for the First Amendment. Public schools, on the other hand, have to take the First Amendment very seriously every single day. In many ways, if you're in a public school, working in a public school, and you come in that door this morning, you might as well picture yourself putting on your First Amendment hat, because you are subject to the First Amendment, you are representing the First Amendment, and how you do what you do determines whether or not you are upholding the First Amendment. You give up some other hats to put on the First Amendment hat, there's no question. You know, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you have to sort of remember that the First Amendment hat goes on top of that hat for the time you're on duty. And that's difficult. And there's going to be a conflict. But if you're a Jehovah's Witness, who is also the band leader, right? And you put on your First Amendment hat because you want to be in a public school, you sign up, you're working in a public school, you're a Jehovah's Witness. You put on your First Amendment hat, you may not know you have, but you have, you sign a contract. You come to the school, and you go into the band, and they say, we want you to teach them, these 4 patriotic songs for the next football game, or whatever it is. What is that person going to do? What do you do? Jehovah's Witnesses can't do patriotic songs. I don't know if you knew that, but they can't. They don't have any political involvement. And that would be idolatry, they cannot do that. They can't salute the flag. There's a public school teacher. So right away, conflict of conscience. But every public school teacher really has the same dilemma, except it may not be as acute as a Jehovah's Witness. Parenthetically, what would you do if you were the principal? Jehovah's Witness said, I'm sorry. All these songs you're going to, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to teach the kids any of these songs. What would you do?
What would you do as the principal?
What?
I said I would call a lawyer.
Call superintendent, tell him it's there.
This whole discussion, let's make lawyers the last readers. Not the first response, although,
Isn't that the same question as the French law that secular government employees can't wear religious
it's just very
ornaments?
similar to conflict of conscience. Right? What do you do?
Oh, that I don't know.
Well, I understand. This is the thing. Conscience conflicts. Now in France, they resolve it by saying government can decide that no Muslim girl can wear a hijab to a school if she goes to a state school. No Jew can wear a yarmulke in a state school. The government can decide that. And it gets more complicated in the United States because, guess what? Liberty of conscience is a very high freedom here, and it's protected constitutionally. So, do you say, what do you say?
This is the only band teacher available.
So maybe, well, no, that's a very good point, Sasha. I mean, maybe, so this is a solution, but maybe this is, you have several band teachers and they're teaching so many different things that this one might not have to teach these particular songs. Could be. But what if it is the only one?
In mine similar, I'd say whatever areas you're certified in, whatever areas can you teach, and if they can't teach any, how many hours do you have to take to get the other certification? I mean, there are options there. And can you get a temporary certificate if we put you in kiting or whatever?
Right. So maybe you have another role here. Maybe
Yes,
this isn't
yes,
your role.
yes.
Because this is so part of your job here, and teaching music is all these patriotic songs are just what we do, that we have no, but I think that's really creative, though, to think of maybe we can still keep you in the profession, and you can still keep your conscience.
So you can imagine if you're a band teacher, then becoming a typing teacher would be.
There's something.
Don't you, well, you have curriculum that's mandated, and those of us in the arts have a lot more flexibility there to substitute. I mean, I would say, what is the skill being taught? Is it a particular type of music? Then something else could be substituted, but I think you have to do what your job mandates in terms of the personality if you're in a public school. So this teacher would have a choice of going somewhere else, or
Yeah, so the answer might be, I'm sorry, but this is what we do, and we can't accommodate it. Yes?
You might have a couple of different options too. Let's say like if it's for marching band or something.
Yeah.
After a football game, they can play a recording. Or it's not the band director actually conducting it, but it's the drum major conducting it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Oh, well. No, because all of this is struggling with how do we accommodate, if we can, a claim of conscience. I mean, the easy way is to say we just don't do it. First of all, I don't think we can, under the First Amendment, just not do it. I think we are required to struggle with it, even if we come out with a solution that says, I'm sorry, we're going to have to get another band teacher because this is so much. So what you just articulated is, this is a sincere religious belief. I think we would stipulate that, as the lawyers say. We're not going to sit here quibbling about whether this is sincere. Right? Yeah?
Well, I was just curious where the line is. If you're teaching a song, you're not lifting your voice towards it. Is that different? You know, when the students are performing or in class or something, you don't necessarily have to genuflect to the flag. You can just stand there.
Right. That's a good point.
Because I'm sure science teachers across the country in some places have to acknowledge different kinds of evolutionary ideas that they may not believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking that in a way that supports what Charles talks about so much about teaching about religions, that it's very similar to the role a religions teacher would take in teaching about faiths that they don't necessarily subscribe to, but we can still teach about it. So could you teach about, I never thought about it this way, could you teach about this music which is historical to our society without actually, I don't know.
And what, I think the flag example is a little easier to deal with than the music example that you raised both. Very interesting question. So why I say there's a difference. If Jehovah's Witness says, my faith does not allow me to teach this music, end of story. Not end of story in what we do to accommodate, end of story to whether we investigate whether Jehovah's Witnesses really believe this, whether all Jehovah's Witnesses do, whether there's a difference between doing this or doing, you know what I'm saying. So in a lot of ways, we are out of the business of getting into the motives. Courts, for example, should never do that. You know, if a kid says, I want to wear my rosary beads, my glow-in-the-dark rosary beads my grandmother gave me, and the local Monsignor says a Catholic doesn't have to wear rosary beads out here. You can put them inside. They don't have to be glow-in-the-dark. It doesn't matter. This kid can be a religion of one in the United States. And that kid won that court case. I like it. I love this country. Texas, state of Texas, that school district didn't want him to wear those because it was a gang symbol. There's no evidence of gang activity wearing rosary beads. He took it all the way to court and he won. I see, that's great. But, so if a Jehovah's Witness can't salute the flag as a teacher, as you say, stand there respectfully, have the kids lead the flag salute. I think accommodating that might be easier. A curriculum, however, with a certain number of patriotic songs that are kind of essential to a football game or whatever, that's hard. And if the Jehovah's Witness says, I just can't do those, for whatever reason, then I think you come to these various solutions that you're talking about, or approaches. Sincere religious belief. Is it a substantial burden to a Jehovah's Witness to make them teach patriotic songs if their conscience says they can? I would say it's a substantial burden. So in that way, you have already a claim of conscience. If you have a sincere religious belief, and now I'm echoing what the court has done, the Supreme Court, or now the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, if you have a sincere religious belief, it's substantially burdened, then the question goes to the government or to the public school. And the two questions the public school have to answer: do you have a compelling interest, state interest, in overriding this claim, and not accommodating this conscience claim? Do you have a substantial interest? It can't be just an interest. I mean, we have an interest in lots of things that aren't substantial, so it's a high burden you can't just deny it just because you don't think a reasonable person would not teach patriotic songs. You have to have substantial reason. Teaching patriotism is a substantial state interest. Whether you agree with that or not, it is. I mean, it's going to, every court's going to say it's a substantial state interest. But the last question in this test about free exercise of religion is the hardest. It's really the hardest. And that is there any less restrictive way you can accomplish this interest except by saying no? Is there anything else you can do? Some of you are starting to get at this. I think you're trying to get at this. Is there anything else we can do? A couple of you are. Is there anything else we could do? And if there is, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can keep this teacher, protect her conscience or his conscience, and the school's interest in teaching patriotism will still be upheld. It's a balancing test. That's the hardest question of this free exercise test that the courts have evolved over the years, because there's all kinds of things you can do to accommodate conscience if you work at it a little bit, and sometimes there's nothing you can do. I would say in this case, it's probably not much you can do. I love the idea of finding maybe another role for the teacher, helping the teacher to get into another area. That's a wonderful, compassionate response. But at some point, there may be nothing else you can do. So I linger on this one little example because it's really a way to tease out that Congress shall make no law respecting establishment religion is one, but then or prohibiting free exercise of religion. No law. Well, of course, there are laws. But no law, at least the starting point is, as far as possible, we don't let government do anything to interfere with the free exercise of religion. Jehovah's Witness is allowed to be Jehovah's, protected to be Jehovah's Witness. So how do we deal with it when it comes up against a state interest? And that's the question. Yeah.
This is a genuine question and not, I don't have an opinion, but I don't know it yet. What is the responsibility of the teacher knowing their religious or practical alignments to not choose to be a patriotic band teacher, patriotic music band teacher? Is there any legal, ethical, what kind of imperative is there for the teacher to not choose that job? Is there any sort of legal?
Well, there's a common sense imperative. I mean, you'd think if somebody wouldn't apply for a job knowing, or if they did know, and surely they would. This happens though. It's interesting that people do go into it and think they can get accommodation for something they ought to have known was difficult, if not impossible, to accommodate. But yes, and of course, under labor law and everything else, the school has plenty of room to say, I'm sorry, you signed up for this. End of story. What I'm talking about is what else can the school do, possibly? And in some circumstances, what must the school do? I think in this case, the school probably has less responsibility to work out accommodation if it's so clear that this job comes with this work than it would be for, say, the pledge issue or something else that might come up that was unanticipated. Then I think the school has to ask these questions about sincerity, about substantial burden, about the state's compelling interest, and is there anything else we can do except say no? Every public school teacher ought to have these questions in mind. You're not lawyers. And you can always call a school board lawyer if you're in doubt, all kidding aside. Better to get the fire truck before the fire, if you know what I mean. So if you're in doubt, of course, you consult an attorney. But just as a general rule, in listening to people's requests for accommodation on a daily basis, it's great to have these questions in your mind. And you might say, well, Charles, does the First Amendment really require us to ask this question of compelling interest? And I would say after 1990, probably not so much. Because Justice Scalia, in his majority opinion in the Flood Division versus Smith case in 1990, weakened the compelling interest test application significantly, saying that we're too diverse now religiously, and we can't possibly have people trying to get exemptions from all these laws. So as long as the law is neutral, applies to everybody, maybe the state no longer has to show that it has a compelling interest to deny exemption from the law. And that decision was so draconian in many people's view, many religious people's view, and from left to right, that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed to correct it. That's why it's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's restoring the compelling interest test. And as you know, under the federal RFRA was struck down as applied to the states in 1997. RFRA was passed in 93, almost unanimously by Congress, signed into law by Bill Clinton. Then the Supreme Court said you've gone too far. You can require this of the federal government, compelling interest test, but not of the states. So that's when states began passing their own RFRAs. New York has one. Some 20s, some states now have one or an equivalent of one. So this compelling interest test is still very, very important. In some states, it may not be as important as in other states. I just think it's good practice for teachers. I think teachers in a religious and private school would do well to use these same questions in their mind, because you may not be as compelled to try to seek accommodation as someone in a public school, but wouldn't you want to do that? If you're an independent or religious school, wouldn't you want to find a way, if you can, to accommodate people in their claims of conscience? So these are good questions to have in mind. This freedom of religion is not just some broad thing. It actually gets to very specific balancing act in each situation. So how do you make the balance? You have to have the right questions to ask. Yes?
I want to kind of rewind slightly and to come back to this, another angle on this question about the Jehovah's Witness band teacher. Because when you first started, going into that, where I thought you were going with that example is that, there are certain ways, I think, that a public school teacher, as a government employee and representative of the state, does have to give up some elements of their free exercise rights while they're in school wearing that First Amendment hat, right? They don't have, I learned this from your work and others, but that, students in a public school have dramatically more latitude for free exercise claims and for, religious speech and practice in school than teachers or other staff do, because the students aren't state employees while the teachers are. So couldn't you say to that Jehovah's Witness, I'm sorry, you're wearing your state employee hat right now, and we'll do our best to accommodate your claim of conscience, but if we can't.
Well, I think that's the key, what you said, if we do our best.
Right.
And why do we do our best? It's because of the free exercise clause and our commitment to religious freedom. But you're absolutely right, we have less scope to accommodate, or less pressure to accommodate if it's an employee than if it's a student. If it's a student, it's a whole other ballgame. So the only reason we're having this struggle is because the Establishment Clause, and that's a good segue to talk about the Establishment Clause. Sometimes I like to talk about the Free Exercise Clause first because it's often overlooked, and the Establishment Clause claims get all the attention. But the Establishment Clause should be in service of the Free Exercise Clause, I think. So government's role, we really should be to protect conscience. And no establishment should be in service of protecting everyone's conscience, not taking sides in religion. But having said that, you're absolutely right. This person has taken on the role of upholding the Establishment Clause. Little Johnny and little Sally, in coming to school every day, they are not the government, right? So they don't have the same Establishment Clause role. They don't. But the teacher does. Having said that, even in the Tinker decision of 1969, which is the high watermark for student rights in schools, as you know, the Tinker decision acknowledges that students do have fundamental rights, and the famous line from the Tinker decision is always quoted, is students do not, right?
These are First Amendment rights at the door of school.
The schoolhouse gate. So students do not, but actually, if you go back to the Tinker, it says teachers and students. Teachers and students do not leave their First Amendment rights, the constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. Now, having said that, of course teachers have free exercise of religious rights, but are they more narrowly protected in a public school like under the establishment? Because of the Establishment Clause, yes. And they're more narrowly expressed, I should say, not protected, they're more narrowly expressed. But take an example of students, of teachers coming in and wearing a cross, right, or a Star of David. I mean, the easy line to draw into the Establishment Clause is that, well, you can't do that. You're here representing the government. You can't send a message of religious, you're a teacher. How about a teacher wearing full garb? It's required by their faith. You can't teach in public school because you're wearing religious garb. So do they have no free exercise right to express their faith at all? And this has been a debate. What do you think? Don't hire people who wear religious garb?
Well, it would seem that you separated the proselytizing segment of that. As long as you're not proselytizing your faith, you choose. I mean, we have any number of choices of dress. Wearing a team T-shirt is really no different than wearing a religious emblem. People wouldn't have that freedom to wear what they want in our culture, unless it's dress code.
Yes?
I think it's important too, because we know it's important that students see themselves represented on the staff. So if all the staff is the same, I don't think it creates as great a community as if you have a staff that can wear their garb, can wear a cross. And as you said, it doesn't mean they're up there, but the students will see themselves.
But the concern, I think, has always been that we have a position of power and authority because of the nature of who we are, and that regardless of our intention, could have an undue influence. I think that's the concern. I think it also depends on the philosophy of your school. I don't think my school would care one way or another about some of these things, but it depends on the school.
Well, you just articulated beautifully the kinds of arguments that we've had throughout history on the religious garb issue. I will say that many states passed laws prohibiting teachers from wearing religious garb, excluding them from employment, arguing under either the state constitutions, many of which are much more separationist than the federal constitution, that would constitute establishment of religion because kids would be influenced. Most of those laws have disappeared. Only one state still has that, Nebraska. Others have been challenged in different ways. There's never been a Supreme Court decision that's actually been very clear on this, although the Supreme Court has allowed states that have said no religious garb religious garb is not a prohibition to keep that. The Supreme Court has pretty much allowed states to make their decisions so far. I think if it came to the Supreme Court today, they would strike it down, but I don't know that for sure. What I'm saying is this is a long story. The reason for no religious garb statutes in the first place were, of course, to keep Catholics from teaching in public school, to keep Catholic nuns and clergy, priests from teaching in public school. That was the honest motive for doing it. wasn't, that was the move. And we have a lot of state constitutions that add so-called blame provisions that don't any funding ever going to anything to do with religion, much stricter than the establishment laws, because they want to keep money out of the Catholic Church or any Catholic affiliated groups. So a lot of state constitutions are still very, very strict. For example, vouchers are now constitutional under the First Amendment, but in many states they're unconstitutional. Vouchers, they're unconstitutional because of state constitutions that are much stricter than the First Amendment.
And the charter schools, where do charter schools fall on that?
Same, public schools. Charter schools are under the constitutional, for constitutional reasons, are exactly like public schools. They are public schools, but I mean, there's no difference. But this is the struggle. I think religious garb laws have fallen away, and I'm glad about that. Oregon got rid of its law a few years ago under pressure because I think it was six that brought it in Oregon. Said, you know, we can't teach in a public school, and so they got rid of it. But so some of you have articulated why diversity is showing kids that we have a diverse country now and so forth. As long as there's no proselytizing involved. Just the fact that you look a certain face should not preclude you from applying for the job. I think there's a distinction between wearing religious garb because it's required by your faith and wearing Jesus Saves t-shirts, which I think is unconstitutional. So you see, I don't think it's all so clear. That may be religious garb if I'm an evangelical and I want to wear Jesus Saves t-shirts, but I don't think I would be upheld by the courts on that because it's a different question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of what's at stake here now is also the difference between religious garb that is required to be worn at all times by a person of faith versus, for want of a better word, optional religious garb. So I don't think it's required of an evangelical Christian to wear a Jesus Saves shirt. Correct me if I'm wrong. I do think even those of us who would most staunchly defend the right of a Muslim woman to be veiled while she teaches math would probably feel a little weird if a Catholic priest, who's the math teacher, comes in with his collar on.
It might feel weird, but
Yeah,
you have to treat them the same.
Exactly, but I think that's sort of that gut reaction.
That's right. I think it's actually one segment of our population is much more interested in religious accommodation when it concerns religious minorities, Muslims, Hindus, and others. Another segment is much more interested in when it concerns evangelicals and traditionalist Christians. You know? So, I mean, I think it should be the same for both, but, you know, I think there's this pull. We are all for religious freedom when it's something you like, and not so much when something you don't.
Is there a distinction to be made for somebody, like a lay person though, versus like a person who's, you know, like a priest versus just, you know, not just a Muslim, but you know what I mean? Like, you know, there's nuns and then there's practicing Catholics. Like, is there?
No, unless if it's considered a requirement of one's faith, I think that's the question. And going back to this first question, right? Sincere religious belief, that's easy. Let's don't even stop and worry about that. Usually people come in with some claim that's sincere, they would be there. Right? Is it a substantial burden? Well, not if you don't have to do it. You know, if it's just, I like to put on this, yeah.
You see, I think that's a crucial distinction because, again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I don't think a Catholic priest has to wear religious garb except when he is performing the role of a Catholic priest. So Catholic priests often in their public life don't wear a collar. I'm pretty sure that's not required. Now, in the old days, nuns had to wear their habits of some orders, but I think at one time it was all orders and then that gradually changed over time. I don't think that's particularly required anymore. But for a Muslim woman, she has to be veiled in public. So there's a choice.
That's an interpretation too.
Well, but if that's how she interprets her religion.
And that would be same for the priest. So this goes back to whether we don't have to get into the business really worrying about whether all priests or no priests or some priests. Again, we have to treat each of these cases as a religion of one, essentially. I mean, there may be There was a fellow who worked in a munitions factory and said, my faith says I cannot work on a certain kind of weapon. I don't want to get the details wrong, but it was, and I need to be accommodated by being moved over to do this and this and this. And they said, they went to his church. This is a true story. They went to his church. And the pastor said, oh, no, we don't believe that. He can work and do that. It's not a part of our... And so, he lost in the lower court because they said, your church says it's not part of your religion. He said, it's part of my faith. He won. In the end, he won. And that's right. In my view, that's exactly right. It's not about what the majority of his church thinks or his pastor thinks or the Pope thinks. It's what you think is your conscience. Yes. So, yeah.
Mine's super quick.
Okay.
Okay, you go first. All right.
Well, I think that is the essence of this lived religion that we're talking about. Like some women of the Muslim faith prefer to live their religion with the hijab, some don't. I mean, it might not be an edict anymore, that's sort of habit, but some might live their religion that way.
Some nuns have to wear hats all the time. So it depends on your work.
Right. So I think that's where we're kind of getting into this religion from the inside out instead of always just paying attention to the doctrine.
We have no, in public schools at least, it's not our business to get into the differences in doctrine. That's all I'm saying. We have to treat people, we have to determine sincerity. If a kid comes and says, I can't take a math test because I'm a half atheist, you might want to say, wait, let me see if this is sincere religious belief. You might want to ask that question. I haven't met a math atheist before, but I'm just saying, sincerity is usually stipulated. We don't have to get into, really, why do you believe this nutty stuff? But we do have to consider whether it's substantially burdened or not. And that gets us a little bit more difficult question. Yes.
I'm assuming that you mentioned one sort of aspect of this, that the Jesus Saves shirt example you gave would be, maybe just testing my own understanding, would be different if there were some perhaps non-denominational church where they even said, like, this is an important t-shirt and this is part of our proselytizing effort and we want you to wear this. I mean, so if it's a religion of one thing and this teacher says, no, I really have to wear this shirt.
I think actually we have a sincere religious belief with the Jesus Saves t-shirt. We have a substantial burden if you tell an evangelical that he or she cannot proclaim the faith. That's part of being evangelical. So I think they passed that test. I don't think we need to get into how many evangelicals wear, or whether it's required or not required. I think then we get to compelling state interest. And do we have a compelling state interest to keep proselytizing out of the classroom by our teachers under the establishment clause? Ding, 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 ding. So that's where Henry's question comes in. It says, so guard questions and things like this. Teachers, yes, we want to protect their free exercise rights, but when it bumps up against the establishment clause, we have to draw a line. And some would argue that wearing a nun's habit is crossing the line. It's proselytizing just by virtue of being there. The trend has been away from that, and I think that's no longer the case, but that was the argument. So there's an argument. What is compelling? Wearing a Jesus Saves t-shirt would be a loser, because I think the courts would see that as proselytizing.
Well, some of these problems get solved in a grander scale by saying no, and a lot of schools do this, no messages, no t-shirts with messages, period.
Right, for students.
For students.
If you,
Well, now we can pull for fact.
well, so, and that raises another cluster of issues. But I do think that one way, even if you do that for students and or teachers, and you have no religious exemptions, there's a problem. Let's say you have no head covering policy in your school. Do you have this in your high school? No head covering? A lot of high schools do. Because of fear of gang activity and so forth. And so kids cannot wear their Yankees cap or whatever it is they want to wear, their football thing, or their gang colors. And it's really out of concern. Student comes in wearing a helmet. Student comes in wearing a hijab. no outcomes. Now, I have to say, Justice Scalia, in his 1990 opinion, infamous Smith decision, sounded like he was saying, game over. This is a neutral policy, applies to all students. It's not saying religious kids can't wear headgear. Then Scalia would say you need to have a compelling reason before you say that. He's saying if it's a neutral law or regulation, it applies to everybody equally. I'm sorry, what can we do? We can't have everybody pop up and say, I need an exception. See, I think that turns the First Amendment on its head, because prohibiting, he's reading that Congress shall make no law prohibiting free exercise means unless the public school makes a law prohibiting a kid from wearing the yarmulke, the Jew doesn't have a right to complain that he's, or the Muslim doesn't have a right to. Well, gee, there are no laws like, very few laws that actually are passed to say, Catholics can't drink wine. It's nobody can drink wine, right? No prohibition. It's not like the Roman Catholic Church can't, right? So Scalia is not giving you anything. If that's the reading of the free exercise clause, he's essentially saying it really doesn't have much force. So that's why RFRA was passed. Because under RFRA, you have to go back to the old standard, and you have to say, okay, what is our compelling interest here? Safety, gang, and we can't accomplish that any other way except by letting no Jews and no Muslims and no Sikhs get wear it. Well, that's ridiculous. Of course we can still, giving exceptions isn't going to ruin our effort. So they would win. I think they would win under Smith even, because if you allow some students to be exempt for wearing head coverings for medical reasons, and you don't allow any exemptions for religious reasons, you're probably going to lose even under Smith. So I'm just saying that parenthetically, so you don't think Smith is the end of the First Amendment. It's not quite. It's just a big blow. And it's treating free exercise as equal protection, which I think is wrong. Also, Scalia said, you want an exemption from a law? Go to the legislature and get them to vote for an exemption. Oh, great. I'm a hardened Christian in South Carolina, and I'm going to go to the legislature in Columbia, and I'm going to say, I want to hand out leaflets at the airport. Good luck with that. You're going to get no votes, 0 votes. If you're a Baptist in South Carolina and you want an exemption from some law, they don't even think about it. They pass it like that. But Utah, the same way. If you're LDS, they're going to pass exemptions. If you're something else, I'm sorry. So Scalia has turned the free exercise clause into a majoritarian issue, which is supposed to be protecting fundamental human right for each individual. So I think Smith's decision is the worst decision since Dred Scott myself. But nevertheless, it's there. I think the public schools, because of parental rights, free speech rights, and others that should be joined with free exercise rights, we should use the compelling interest test. I think that is the safest way. Yes.
My question's a little different. I'm thinking rather than like a teacher proselytizing religion, but what I would see like proselytizing factual information, and then parents withdrawing because it offends their religion or goes against religious values. So just thinking like our school, we've talked a lot about same-gender families or like transgender identity, and a few people withdrawing from the school. I teach an independent school. Or just withdrawing their kids from those particular activities on those grounds of like this is not part of our faith. And then, I'm kind of like, these are just factual pieces of information. This is not religious information, but I don't know if we can just talk about that line.
I think, Jake, that's a really, really important point, because it raises a number of issues at once. For public schools and private schools, it's a little different set of issues. I think it's up to the private and independent school to decide this is our curriculum, and then stick with it if parents want to opt out. I do think that as a matter of civic responsibility, we should give opt-out options if we can, accommodate if we can. Independent private school has less compulsion really under the law, it doesn't have to do as much accommodating as a public school. Let's just say, I think it's a good thing if they do. But of course, a parental objection to something in the curriculum that the school has decided, or in the case of public, the school board has decided is the curriculum. Can't change the curriculum for everybody. There's a political process, of course. They can vote out the school board in the case of a public school. In the case of an independent school, parents can organize and if they withdraw financial support, get a change in leadership, and change the curriculum. So everything is political, right, in schooling. Schooling is very political. But once these decisions have been made about curriculum, there's no such, I would say it's hard to say there's some things that are facts that are incontrovertible, very little, maybe some things in that. But most of it is a political decision. Teaching LGBT issues is a political decision. I think it's the right decision, but it is going to fly in the face of many religious beliefs, and schools are then going to have to determine how they're going to negotiate that. They may lose people, they may have a little revolution, and they may have a change in leadership, but they have the right to make those decisions. Right? So, evolutionary theory, most scientists agree this is the way to understand biology. There are deeply, deep dissenters to that. I think that's teaching a religion or teaching a worldview. So, but if the school board decides it, the curriculum decides it, then the question becomes, how do we deal with parental rights in these scenarios? And independent schools probably, again, have more choice in how they deal with parental rights than a public school. Public school, under the Constitution, the Supreme Court has generally acknowledged in Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1923 for the first time, when it decided that, as I mentioned earlier, parents have the right to send their kids to a religious or private school if they so choose. Sounds obvious now. But Oregon said you can't. Oregon said parents must send their kids to public schools. Again, they didn't want Catholics to be going to Catholic schools. The Supreme Court overturned that law and said parents have the primary responsibility for the upbringing of their children, including education. Public schools, therefore, have to remember that parents have the fundamental right and responsibility for the upbringing of their children. So when they come in the door and they want exceptions, now having said that, parental rights have not fared very well in the courts since then, in the same way they're not that vigorously protected, in my view, but they're there. And especially if combined with another right, like free exercise, if a parent comes in with a religious objection or some other right, it's going to be very powerful legal argument. So parents in public schools have objected to the LGBT curriculum. As you know, Massachusetts and elsewhere early on, they have not fared very well in the courts with these objections. But the balancing act that has to relate to that is important. So I would say that schools, in many cases for these requests, have to have some way of accommodating, as long as the accommodation is feasible and reasonable. And of course, those are words that are elastic, but you know, I mean, you have to work at it. But if you can accommodate someone who wants to be exempt from a particular lesson, that may be reasonable and feasible to do that. Say, well, we'll give you an alternative assignment. If, however, I want to be, my child to be excused every time you talk about religion and it's a world history class, that would be pretty difficult to accommodate. In fact, impossible if you're teaching a good world history class. So you may not be able to. So you have a compelling interest to teach history in a public school. Nobody's going to question that. No court is going to say you don't have a compelling interest to teach history or reading or arithmetic or whatever. The question is there any less restrictive way of accomplishing that interest? For example, you may have a compelling interest to teach Johnny to read. You do. We require people to learn to read. If you homeschool, if you go to an independent school, if you go to a public school, we require you to learn to read in this country because we consider it a compelling interest. But do we have a compelling interest to make Johnny read every story we assign? That's hard. I don't think so. We have a compelling interest to to teach reading, but we may actually be able to give an alternative assignment. As long as the request is limited, is feasible to accomplish without undermining the whole course of the, or the teaching that you're doing. Again, it's a balancing act. And opting out of controversial things, I think, is an essential practice. It seems to me that if you don't have a good opt-out policy, you can lose a lawsuit. So I think in that sense, it's more obligatory to really have an opt-out policy. Independent school, less so. The public school, I think, mandatory. I like opt-in, particularly controversial things, because I think that puts parents in a position of knowing about it and deciding they're going to either let their students do it, children do it, or not. And for particularly controversial things, then I think opt-in is a good model. We have to get away from the idea, and school boards particularly, that somehow we know what's best for every kid, and everything we teach has to be taught for everybody. Having said that, to accommodate people individually is very challenging and can be messy. And the whole LGBT question has pushed this to the forefront again, because this is, of course, a battle line now for a lot of people. They don't want the curriculum to have, LGBT history in it and so forth. But, that's happening, and that's going to happen. In California, it's by law required to teach LGBT issues in history. And the question is, how do you accommodate those people who don't want to be there? Again, if it's a limited request, I don't want to be there on this day, you might be able to accommodate. If it's an expansive request, I don't think you can. So it's tough. Again, it's a balance. We should talk about neutrality now, because I think the free exercise discussion has implicated the establishment clause in so many ways as we've talked about these scenarios, but we haven't explicitly talked about what it means under the establishment clause for going back to Henry's question about the teacher, or his comment about the teacher's role being different from, or position being different from the students. So the first part of the First Amendment, of course, Congress should no law respecting an establishment of religion, commonly called the Establishment Clause, sometimes referred to as a separation of church and state, has been the subject of endless debate in American history, as you know. This is one of the longest running debates. We all are in favor of separation of church and state, even though that phrase now has come under attack. But Americans generally have always supported the principle of no establishment or separation. They just mean very different things by applying. So there's good news, and that this arrangement in religious freedom has broad support, has for a very long time. The more difficult news is that we disagree about how to apply these principles. And I've already talked about the difficulty now in applying free exercise in this kind of religious diverse society. I mean, Justice Scalia had a point. This is a very difficult society to be fair to all these different claims, all these religions in one, right? And it's very difficult. And what about people who don't have a religious affiliation? Do they also fall under protection of conscience? Oh my gosh, so that's a whole other discussion. So, but the establishment clause is also very difficult, and for a different set of reasons. What does it mean for government, for government to have no involvement, no law respecting an establishment of religion? Well, you read the Schiff decision, which applies the establishment clause to the public school. If you had a chance to read through that decision, and it's a lot to go through, so maybe you haven't so much, but those of you who did, and then the concurring opinions, the dissent, what was your takeaway as to what the Supreme Court is trying to say about what the establishment clause means for public schools? can also answer your own perspective about it, and nothing jumps out of the chef for you at this moment. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
I think a portion of the debate involved the idea of a secular school being kind of representation that benefited certain people's interpretations. That like a secular school almost is like against religion. And that was
In the dissent, certainly, that's right. Justice Stewart was very concerned that this idea of neutrality or not allowing teacher-led career would turn into a school that is hostile to religion. I think that's exactly what his concern was. Did you want to? Yes.
I was just going to say, I think it was Brennan who ended his concurring opinion. What stood out to me was just where he said that the goal is to have a state without religion and a church without politics, and neither was to be used as an engine for any purpose or the other. Just the idea of how important it was to keep the two away from each other. Really thought that was a unique way to end.
Other things we got? Yes.
Parks, Jordan was talking about the union of both church and state, and that it destroys government and creates religion. That reminded me of some of the language from Williams that we had read out here. That really stood out to me.
Yeah, I think that's really, that is an echo of that was Madison, James Madison's view too, and the justices, if they quoted anything, any document, more than any other document, would be Madison's memorial remonstrance, his argument for disestablishment in Virginia. They quoted that time and time again. And Madison was very strong that any government containing under religion corrupted religion and corrupted the state. Anything else about that issue on this? Do you want to comment? Yes.
I found interesting the idea that allowing people to opt out wasn't enough because it would stigmatize the people who chose on the basis of non-belief as atheists or non-conformists or whatever. And because I hadn't thought of that when I originally considered the case, but I guess there is a sort of subtle implication that you are an outsider if you choose to opt out.
And that's the best, I think you picked up on one of the most difficult and contentious pieces of this whole conversation, because many people, including Justice Stewart, just couldn't understand, well, people don't have to do this. Why take it away from everybody else? In fact, he would argue that you're violating free exercise of religion of everybody else by shutting it down. Because these students don't want to participate. Why don't they just not participate?
That goes to your religion of one. I think those are exactly where it was. It doesn't matter how many people this affects. It affects one. That's not okay.
Yeah, well, and that's tricky because then, that for free exercise is sort of easier to broker. So if you're going to accommodate me, even though my beliefs may be unique to me, but what if I don't want a book in the library because of my beliefs? Take this book out of the library because you know it offends my faith. Well, that means no kid gets to read the book. And so under the Establishment Clause, we have a different situation when there's a speech clause. So the question is how?
That's not an active. If you're not reading the book, you're not stigmatizing yourself. Or you're not having your child read the book. They're not remove themselves from the room during prayer. So that's the difference.
Right. But if 99% of the kids and parents want to have that prayer anymore, why should one person, the Shem family, be able to essentially veto the practice for everybody? That's Stewart's point. He doesn't get it. But others would argue, well, and this was kind of a creative new thought. Well, wait a minute. that's still coercive. If you make the kid go out in the hall or whatever, the state is still coercive. And that, that's a pretty strong understanding of the establishment clause. Right? And I think it's breaking new ground here for us back in the 60s to think that the state, Justice Stewart did not think it was state establishment of religion to allow the state to lead kids who wanted to in prayer. In that time, most people, that's what they thought. I think now we see that that's a violation of conscience, even though everybody wants to do it. It doesn't matter if 99% of people want to do it. The state violates conscience by getting involved in religion. This is the point of the other justice. So what does it mean for the state to be neutral? If that's the case, if no longer the state can lead the kids in a religious exercise, even if they want to have a religious exercise, then what does it mean for the state to be neutral?
Well, it meant that there was no coverage of religion at all if the state is truly neutral. That's why it's left out now. I mean, that there's no truly leave religion outside, account for its role in culture and in history. To me, I've read so much I can't remember where that came from. It came from something later, but the idea is that that neutrality means no coverage whatsoever, and that's the problem with that.
If that's what neutrality means.
Yes.
If that's what neutrality means, one way of interpreting neutrality is keep it out, and then you're neutral. Yeah.
But I don't think that's exactly what they said in this case, because it's not that they didn't allow any form of religious practice in schools. It's that they didn't allow formalized practice led by teachers, because I think the way I look at it is if 99% of the parents and children wanted a prayer at the beginning of school, that's different than saying those who want to pray can pray. This is saying we're all going to pray, and those of you who don't want to don't have to. And that's not neutral. So neutrality in this case would be saying it's an equal playing field for anybody who wants to have, so like you can go during club period and have prayer, or during your lunch period you can say your prayers or something like that. We're not going to prevent you from doing that because that would be against the First Amendment. But once the school is saying everybody's doing this except the people who don't want to, that's not neutral.
Okay, that's helpful, yeah.
I'd like some clarification. I'd even be interested in hearing what the rest of the states are doing. Like Illinois has a state moment of silence at the beginning of each step.
Right.
And we are sometimes slightly and other times forced to maintain and help create an environment that's conducive to the moment of silence. And I have students who outwardly will make noise. Where is that at your level with regards to my role as a public educator, the students' rights to interrupt this moment of silence, or outwardly pray in front of? I'd love to know, because it seems none of us, even as a world religion teacher, I just sort of stand there. I don't even want to choose. There's my neutrality, because I just stand there and I don't support the silence and I don't support the noise. I don't know if any other states have.
No, many states have it. Okay. Yeah, we have one in Virginia, moment of silence law. So that's a great case to think about neutrality.
Every single day, a moment of silence?
Yeah.
So we have live morning announcements on TV that are projected, and right at the end of it, the students lead us, and so they're like, and now we'll have a moment of silence.
We do not.
Many states do, some
Is
states.
it literally 60 seconds?
No, I'd say it's about 15, 10, 15. It's wild, I mean,
When you say students make noise, are they just like cutting up and they're chatting with their friends, or is it like a social and political stance that I will make noise during this moment of silence?
No, I would say it's probably more conversational. We don't have protests, but there's so many that just care and refuse to be quiet. I think sometimes it's very
And it's
American.
mandated by
Yeah.
your state.
They do it after, like, tragic events have taken place in our community, or, like, never.
So the background to this is, after the Schimpf decision, actually, and the Vitality decision before that, the backlash, as many of you know this history, was the most serious backlash to any Supreme Court decision in American history. Probably only Roe v. Wade has surpassed the prayer decisions for anger and backlash. The country was deeply divided, and there has been since then a perennial effort in Congress to amend the First Amendment to allow prayer in school, which is a bit of a misnomer because the Supreme Court did not strike down prayer in school in the Schimpf decision, as you know. Now having read it, it struck down state-sponsored prayer in school, right? So it's a huge difference. It didn't say kids can't pray. It said the state may not lead prayers, impose prayers. So that wasn't heard. What was heard is God is being kicked out of the schools. And again, going back to the Puritan anxiety, the Winthrop vision, right? Very much said to people, you are taking away our acknowledgement of our dependence on God as a people. And that will lead to moral chaos and our downfall and our loss of freedom. People sincerely believe this, and many people still do. They date a lot of the moral problems in the United States back to the Schimpf and the Vitality decisions. And they said, you see what happened after that? We took God out. They mean it in a deeper way than it sounds, but they actually think that the country fell away from God, and that was symbolic of the fall away. So it's a very serious business for a lot of people, this decision to take God out. But the backlash to that was, let's put God back. And amending the First Amendment, it's never been done in American history. So it's a very dangerous and problematic thing to amend the First Amendment because all bets are off. And the Supreme Court is very aware of this. I can tell you the Supreme Court probably didn't touch the under God in the pledge for this very reason. Because that's just not the mountain molehill they want to die on. The next day, the Congress would amend the Constitution to allow under God in the pledge. I can guarantee you, and I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't get amended and upheld by the states. The Supreme Court knows this. They know that they're dealing with a very volatile thing here, and whether they're liberal justices or conservative, they understand that amending the First Amendment is a frightening prospect. But every Congress, almost every Congress, has tried to pass a prayer amendment. They've come close. They've never made it quite. I was involved in a lot of that in the Clinton years because a lot of the guidelines we did about how you deal with religion in schools, President Clinton asked me to do some of them because, frankly, they wanted to stop the prayer amendment, the Ishtar. That's not why I did it, but I actually believe that we can have religion in schools under the First Amendment in a way that's appropriate. So that's why I agreed to do the guidelines. Then he sent them out to every public school in the United States. And it did help stop the Ishtar Amendment. It took the power out of it, because if you have an alternative that shows that there's plenty of room for religion in schools, it takes the wind out of it. Schools, there's no religion, you can't mention God, which is nonsense. You can carry a gun into school, but you can't say a prayer. All this nonsense. So, this has been a perennial fight. So the moment of silence, John, grew out of this fight. One of the options would be, all right, let's keep knocking on the door. Let's keep knocking on the door. We can't have prayer, maybe we can have this, maybe we can have that. And there's still state laws right now and passed recently trying to do this, to get what they consider prayer back in school. The Alabama passed a moment of silence law, kind of in the early 80s or whatever it was, late 70s, I don't remember. And the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. But in striking it down, they looked at why Alabama had passed the moment of silence law. And it was replete with references by the legislators that we want to get prayer back in school. We want God back. Justice O'Connor, writing for the majority, took that legislative history into account. Some other justices think that's wrong to do. She did. And she said, we know what you're doing. And that's unconstitutional. This public schools may not promote religion. May not endorse, her test was endorsement. May not endorse religion. So, but she also said in her opinion, a genuinely neutral moment of silence, I'm paraphrasing, would be fine. So, subsequent to the Alabama law, other moment of silence laws have passed that are, on the face of them at least, clean. There's no legislative history that we really want to get prayer back in there. They are, in effect, meant to be genuinely neutral. So that's why this neutrality question is so important. What does it mean to be neutral? Genuinely neutral would be students are free during that time of silence to, in some of the laws, list options. They can pray, meditate, think about the day, or whatever. As long as the law is crafted that way, it's constitutional. In the lower courts, they've all been upheld as constitutional. Nobody even bothers anymore to think about a Supreme Court decision because it's so clear. So, is it constitutional to have a moment of silence? Yes, if it isn't used to promote religion. In other words, if a teacher gets up to lead the moment of silence and the teacher says, you know, this is a moment of silence and you're all going to be silent and you're free to do what you like. I mean, there are ways that teachers can signal that you're supposed to pray. That's unconstitutional.
So how do you explain it to the children then? What do you?
You just say what the law says. This is a moment of silence and you are free in this time to reflect on your day, to meditate if you like, to pray if you like. It's up to you. This is a time set aside by our school system for you to do any of the above. That's a genuinely neutral moment of silence. Not either saying you should do this or you should not do this. Do the students have to be quiet during that time? Absolutely yes. This is not a matter of choice. They have to be silent. Now, if you don't want to discipline them, but then you're putting yourself in a position, frankly, of being disciplined yourself, because it's not the kids, it's you that has the responsibility. If it's been mandated by the school board that the district is going to have this moment of silence, like the pledge, you have the pledge, you have the moment of silence. Kids can opt out of the pledge. If they want to opt out of the moment of silence, it's trickier because of what to do. You can't disturb it for the rest of the kids. You can leave the room. And there is a student I know in Virginia, I met him some years ago, he's probably graduated by now, who chose to do that. He chose to leave the room during the moment of silence because he had a conscientious objection to the fact the school was doing that. He thought it was a subterfuge for prayer, and he didn't want to be participating in that. That's his right. But he chose to leave. Unlike prayer, you know, you sometimes, that would be different. The court has said, you know, we don't have the state involved in religion and then have people opt out. That doesn't. But other things the state does, the state has the right to do, and people might have to then take it on themselves to opt out. You know, to be religious or to be a person of conscience, to be an atheist of conscience, may require you to be different. May require you to walk out into the hall and be different. That's up to you. And you have to accept that. It's like wearing a yarmulke, you know, you're different. But, you know, you're protected to be different. But the moment of silence, if it's mandated by the state, is a moment of silence. And they're free to do whatever they want. You know, that's where the law is right now. Did you want to add to that?
No, you got at it. We have a moment of silence in Virginia too, as you mentioned when I taught there, and the silence part was the biggest aspect of it. But we had that come up too. Kids saying, "Why can't I make noise? It's my right." And the way we handled it, and I think this is what you're saying. Hope we did it right. Was that you couldn't prohibit the free exercise of somebody else to pray, and that the noise and deliberate distraction was against that. I mean, would you?
No, it's also, I mean, it's more that this is the state requirement. I know it sounds cold, but if the state requires the Pledge of Allegiance, if the state requires you to to read a certain history book, you know, game over, right? I mean, it's a political process. The school board makes these determinations. Elect your school board members if you don't like the Pledge of Allegiance in your school, or you opt out. Now, the Supreme Court has said students do not have to say the Pledge of Allegiance if they want to opt out. Can they disrupt the class with saying the pledge? No, they may not. There's been a debate as to whether they can sit when everyone else is standing. I think they can. Some school districts are really pissy about this and say, you know, you have to stand and be respectful. I think that's wrong. I think the Supreme Court has made it clear that you can't coerce people to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I don't think you can coerce people to participate in a moment of silence, but you can't have them disrupted for other people. That's not right.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And it was, I remember the moment we had this thing closing, we had a French exchange group with us.
Oh, wow.
And it was their first time in America. And they were like, well, wait, you're the freest country on earth. And yet we all stood and recited the pledge together and then all followed a moment of silence. And they're like, this is not America that we thought. It was a very telling moment for them. It was like striking that we all stood like good little soldiers and did our
Yeah, but the one, it's a teachable moment because I think, you know, and I think the pledge is a whole other thing, but the French ought to really think about the fact that we are pledging, no, I do think they ought to think that we're pledging the flag. One of the things that we're pledging to is the freedom for people to wear a headscarf to school. Because that's their conscience. We are pledging allegiance to that. We're also pledging allegiance to kids who don't want to pledge allegiance. I tell you what, there are not many places in the world where you are actually saying, I pledge to uphold the right of people to not be patriotic, not what we consider patriotic. Fantastic. So, but that's lost when you just said, you know, but I think the deeper thing is that we, at our best, on our best days, you know, we try to protect conscience where we can. And that's still, I think, our difference.
I just had a question going back to that, because I've been one of this since I was reading this. So I see it's decided in 1963. Is that when it was supposed to have gone into practice? Or how long did that? Because I remember as in first or second grade, which would have been 66, 67, having to stand up and say the Lord's Prayer, you know, pledge allegiance to the Lord's Prayer every single morning. So I was just kind of curious how long that process took.
School districts, you know, it's like Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. When I moved back to New York from going to school here at Stuyvesant, went to Myrtle Beach High School, can you imagine the contrast in South Carolina? And that was the first year, 1965, of desegregation. 1954, 1965, and finally desegregated. So the Supreme Court made, as President Jackson said, they've now let them enforce it. It's really difficult. It takes years to add more lawsuits, more fights, more local resistance. There's tremendous resistance to the prayers decision about prayer. Tremendous resistance. And some of it was resistance in the form of we're not doing it. Right. We're just not going to do it. And that took years and years and years and more litigation in the lower courts, more fights, more threats of lawsuits, and finally everybody, there's still some outliers. Sure. There's still, in the Deep South, in some districts, they won't do exactly that, but they will have kids giving prayers over the loudspeaker, for example. And they will say, well, that's student prayer, but it's broadcast to everybody. Yeah, so. But the moment of silence then was a way to kind of, and to be fair, I can see it. I mean, we live in a country where we're struggling to accommodate people in different ways. And in some ways, the moment of silence, as long as it's presented genuinely neutral way, which maybe it's not in some places, is a way of trying to do both. Actually now, someone mentioned earlier about students being able to pray. Students can pray in many different ways in public schools. The problem is many schools don't have policies on this, or clarity on this, so people don't realize just how many religious liberty rights students have under the First Amendment. Yes?
Just curious, I was listening to this, our allegiance, and it's interesting to me that my impression is your students actually say it. My students, it's like a joke. Like we have like a morning TV show, which is great, but just before they always start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and everybody just laughs and sits there. And the reasoning behind that, most of my students, I work in a very diverse school, most of my students are students of color, and they're like, liberty and justice, you know, like they just think it's a joke, like they won't even say it. So when you gave that example of pledging allegiance for people to have whatever rights, I think that's just a really interesting perspective. Like I just kind of say, hey, you're right not to say it, you know? So and also what you said, Jacob, like that's how religious issues play out for me in reality. It's less about the teachers and more about students saying, you know, just myself an example, I'm teaching history with a liberal bias that talks about gay rights or women's rights, and that goes against my religion, so I'm going to have my parents call the school, like that type of thing. That's what really plays out. So just curious.
Well, I think one of the things to say about the pledge and our responsibilities, it seems to me if the school board mandates the pledge, I think it's the responsibility of teachers to have a conversation with students about what it means and to help them make that decision as to whether they opt out or not. I think opting out on grounds of conscience is a very important and maybe sacred right. But if they're just opting out because they don't like it or understand it or they're just cutting up, it just diminishes, to me, the power of that right. So I think if all of our students opt out after we've had that conversation, which may be the case, they will be doing it then out of understanding of what it is the pledge represents and why they do feel like they don't want to participate in this patriotic exercise.
I'm sorry, I want to be clear. It's not that they make a joke out of the pledge itself. What they're saying is that, we have had this conversation, that it's almost offensive to them because they feel so oppressed and that it does not, the words of the Pledge of Allegiance do not resonate with their reality.
Right. And I think that's really appropriate for them to then make that decision. And that's why, you know, the students who want to do it, they should understand that what they're pledging to is the right of these students not to do it. They often don't get that, but if they do, then I think it's more powerful when they do it. But you know, absolutely, the students, liberty and justice for all. I think it's a real conversation as to whether we say that aspirationally. We're saying that as kind of a smart way that we've achieved it. I mean, that's all sorts of issues it is. Whether we should be saying it at all.
I think another interesting spin on neutrality is the whole issue about school calendars. And, that was certainly a big issue recently in New York City. What my school did, and I work in a private school, they just came up with a policy that for any religious holiday, for whatever religion you personally define it, you are allowed not to come to school. There's no penalty. Anything you miss, the teacher must let you make up. But we still have Rosh Hashanah off. and winter break is brackets Christmas, but nothing about Easter.
We've been touching on a lot of these anyway.
We have that same policy, and parents claim cruises as religious experience because of it. They say our family is our religion, and our family needs to travel to Mexico. And so there's some problems with that.
Well, and that's where
they claim a religion.
I know, but that's where we start.
Yeah.
So, sincere religious belief, substantial burden are appropriate questions. And people have to, this flying spaghetti monster people recently tried to get status as a religion. And I know they're pushing because they don't want any religious group to get special status. So I know why they're doing it. The point is, the judge said no. This is not. I don't accept that this is a sincere religious belief. So the courts have to have some way of testing these claims. Yeah.
Didn't some of them get the right to wear the strainer on their heads on IDs though?
Like
Yeah.
Yeah, if it doesn't interfere with identification, then it doesn't matter to the state. It should matter to the state. In other words, neutrality means you treat everyone as on a level playing field under the Establishment Clause. You treat all these religious claims in the same way. The government doesn't take sides. So just because someone's head covering may be, making fun or ridiculous or whatever, doesn't matter. But if you want to wear a burqa and cover your face so the police don't know what you look like, your compelling interest, your substantial burden may be overridden by a compelling interest of the state. So that's how it works. Teaching in public school in a nun's habit is one thing, or a job. Teacher teaching in public school covering her face? I don't think so. But again, it's a balancing test. So I don't know how many of these we want to talk about. I just thought, since time is ticking away, that some of these we've integrated, we've already commented on and given views on. We talked about number 4. I didn't say that wearing religious jewelry is generally accepted as being fine in the first one. It is modest religious jewelry. I didn't say that, but I meant to say that, yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing to the neutrality discussion. In your book, there was discussion too of being too neutral, that privileges be secular,
right?
Kind of in an unconscious way. And I just never really thought of it that way. I thought that was really interesting. So to be truly neutral, everyone has to be sitting at the table, as opposed to nobody at all.
I'm glad you raised that, because Henry wanted to raise that too, and I forgot, but I did want to raise that. So let's pause for a moment on that issue, because Warren and I walk right up to the edge, and this is controversial, and not everyone accepts it, but we walk right up to the edge of saying that perhaps neutrality under the Establishment Clause means that religion must be included in the curriculum as part of teaching about religion. Teaching about religions must be included in the curriculum. Religious worldviews must be included. And we do that because, for us, the word neutrality under the Establishment Clause means, in a word, fairness. And it seemed to us, in looking at the public school curriculum, that for a very long time, it's a little less so now than it used to be, for a very long time, the conventional wisdom behind the public school curriculum was, you can learn everything you need to know about virtually everything, and learn nothing about religion, and you're educated. And then you are teaching subject matters, history, literature, and so forth, as disciplines, as defined by the prevailing view in the academy. So they're all through a secular lens. We think you should teach the subject of history, not the discipline of history. And the distinction we make is if you teach the subject of history, you're going to at least allow a number of other perspectives about what history means into the discussion. True, prevailing view in the academy is going to take most attention. But currently in the world, many people look at what's happening in the Middle East, just to take that as an easy example, and they see it as what God is doing, what Allah is doing, or what Jesus is doing. They see it through a religious understanding of the world and history. History is not all seen one way by people. And certainly, religious ways of seeing the world are not something people used to believe a long time ago. They are live options for people. We think if you don't allow students to be exposed to those live options in people's lives, you're essentially saying to them that it doesn't matter. That there's history, we all know what history is, and then there are these, views of the world that are obviously not important, but they are important. And who's to say what is history? So we think, at least in a minority report kind of way, these other ways of understanding the world, ways of seeing the world, need to be included in the curriculum. So that's why we took very seriously Justice Goldberg's concurring opinion in Shep. And in his concurring opinion, he says, It is said, and I agree, that the attitude of government toward religion must be one of neutrality. But untutored devotion to the concept of neutrality can lead to invocation or approval of results which partake not simply of that non-interference and non-involvement with the religious, which the Constitution commands, but of a brooding and pervasive devotion to the secular and a passive or even active hostility to the religious. Such results are not only not compelled by the Constitution, but it seems to me prohibited by it. Neither government nor this court can or should ignore the significance of the fact that a vast portion of our people believe in and worship God, and that many of our legal, political, and personal values derive historically from religious teachings. Government must inevitably take cognizance of the existence of religion, and indeed, under certain circumstances, the First Amendment may require that it do so. And it seems clear to me from the opinions in the present and past cases that the court would recognize the propriety of providing military chaplains and of the teaching about religion, as distinguished from the teaching of religion in the public schools. It goes on. Examples can be readily multiplied, and so forth. So, for Justice Goldberg in any way, he comes with Warren and I right up to that edge of saying, wait a minute, if you ignore religious worldviews, if there's very little, and in the 1980s, there was almost no mention of religion in the curriculum. It's better now than it was in public school curriculum. If you leave all of that out and teach all subjects through the secular lens, does that rise to the level of establishment of religion? Is that truly neutral under the establishment clause? And we have real questions about that. Denigrating religion, ignoring religion, is also a First Amendment issue. So the teacher that stands up and says, you know, you believe in creationism, that's bunkum and you're ridiculous if your church is teaching you false truth. That's just as unconstitutional as a teacher who stands up and says, you know, only Jesus is the only way to God is through Christ. That's unconstitutional. It's also unconstitutional to denigrate a religion. So neutrality means fairness to different perspectives. It means teaching about fairly different perspectives. But if there's only one perspective, is that genuinely neutral? That's the question we raise. The courts have not gone there exactly, but I think the Supreme Court has come very close to saying, you know, that neutrality in public schools is fairness. It's fairness. Whether or not the court would take a case where the curriculum is challenged, there was a lower court decision in the 1980s out of Alabama, which was a bit of an absurd kind of thing in a way, but in another way it was telling, where parents objected to the Alabama curriculum because they said it taught the religion of secular humanism, which was, you know, a way of trying to say, look, if you ignore all of our worldviews in a curriculum, aren't you essentially saying that there's only one worldview? And Judge Hand in Alabama agreed with them and said, yes, in fact, that is an establishment of religion. Now, that was overturned by the appeals court. So, and I didn't agree with Judge Hand, but I understand why those parents felt that way. That's all I'm saying. And I think if we don't acknowledge somehow, it's always, when we have a worldview that's the dominant worldview, it's hard to say that it's hard for us to admit that it's a worldview. Right? It's only a worldview when someone else wants in. Ours is just teaching history. We're just teaching literature. We don't stop to think about what we bring to that. Famous historical example is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believed that schools should not be teaching religion. He thought they should just be teaching the truth. And the truth, of course, was that there's only a Unitarian, one God, a deist kind of God. And it's self-evident if you're a educated, reasonable person. But he didn't, and he said that Trinitarianism was so superstitious and ridiculous that it would fade away in a few decades. He was convinced that if you set up education right, and people learn properly, that this belief in the nonsense of the Trinity would disappear. But he didn't recognize what he was proposing for public schools was a worldview. He just thought it was the truth. Schools should just teach what's true. Well, what in the heck is that? And that's where Warren and I, in this maybe postmodern world, are again raising this question: do we really have? Are we on the right footing educationally? We just assume there's only one lens through which you interpret all of the subjects that we teach. And shouldn't we take a step back and say, wait a minute, maybe there are other ways of seeing the world that we should expose students to? Obviously, we can't, everything can't get equal time. It's not required under the First Amendment. But what you're doing by teaching about religions, I think, is allowing other worldviews to be part of the conversation, which is a fantastic thing, I think, because it gives people opportunity, students to see, oh, people see the world differently. And that's essential. There's not just one way to see the world. That's why we think of teaching about religions as something we need to do seriously. And going back to the grid conversation, which I missed, but I know what it is because I've heard you talk about it before. You know, if we don't take religion seriously, and what Henry's doing is so fantastic because it's taking it seriously in a way that helps people get in the inside, then I think we are cheating students of a real education. And they're not prepared to deal with other people or with the world if they don't understand that there are ways of seeing the world that are very, very different from one another. And that's at the root of so many of our conflicts and our issues, and we need to start by letting them in. So that's neutrality to me. Yes?
I guess we tend to talk about teaching about religion, about the substance of world religions, but it seems to me that there's really, from an academic standpoint or intellectual standpoint, there's really important skills that can be cultivated and nurtured by taking religion seriously, like introspection and interiority and the ability to have meta-narrative. And so that wouldn't be about religion, but that this whole area develops and cultivates. Does that ever come into conversation about?
Yeah, I'm sure that's one of the things that you're going to be exploring this time here is just what does it actually mean? And I think it has to mean more, has to mean letting kids know that there's more to life, you know, than learning this little set of things about a religion. That there's so much that goes into this experience of being a religious person in different ways, or being an atheist. There's a lot that goes into that. And it's a very, you know, but if students don't understand those parts of life and what those experiences are, then they won't be able to know it for themselves, and you're cutting them off, I think. From so much of what humanity has struggled with and experienced for ages, we're just cutting them off out of fear of a lawsuit, or, you know, because we think the First Amendment means keep it out, or whatever the reasons are, or we just develop this way in order to kind of control what we teach. But I think opening it up and having these experiences that you all will be exploring during your time here, and that's just opening up a world for students, worlds for students that they don't otherwise have. It's fantastic. So anything on this list that we want to talk about, we didn't get to, because we actually followed some of these things. The first one came up in the very first session this morning before I started, about role playing and so forth.
Although your example here is a little different, I think, from what Tiffany was talking about before, because the distinction between a local rabbi agreeing to help lead students through the prayers of a Seder versus students doing something themselves seems like a key. That would seem to be a key distinction.
Yeah, that's one difference, yeah. You want to have thoughts on this? Because we're running out of time, so I don't give much time for any of these, but yeah.
In the school that I used to teach at, they had something where it was, they would study different saints and then dress up as the saints. And it was stopped after a while because it was seen as inappropriate to try to recreate those, and that it was this confusing line of, how can you do that respectfully? There wasn't a respectful way to do that.
Because this was a public school?
No, it was a private school.
Private school. Even so, I think the issue of respect for the faith itself and authenticity are real issues. In recreating anything. Yes, please.
I was actually going to ask a question similar to this one, to this kind of like scenario. I think that if this, if this was like a whole lesson, like a whole unit about Judaism, and that there was some like academic secular purpose to it, right, then I don't think that it would be. I feel like it's permissible. I think that if we're trying to learn about how to teach a lived religion, then I think that we'd be remiss to not include some sort of like experiential aspect of religion. And so I was thinking about, I can't remember exactly where this was. I want to say it was in Tennessee this year. There was a teacher who had, I think it was her students write the, like in Arabic, like there's no God but God, right? In Virginia. And I'm not sure exactly how that, does anybody know?
Yeah, there was one in Tennessee, Virginia, and another state. This popped up in a lot of places.
So is that, I mean, that feels kind of similar.
And there was a lawsuit in California a number of years ago about students dressing up in Muslim garb and recreating the pilgrimage. So, glorifying that. And there's a recent lawsuit about yoga also in schools. There's been a lawsuit about TM in schools.
I think it's different to ask a student to write "There is no God" because they're writing that than to have somebody come in and present something in which they are an expert in.
Well, but this isn't, I mean, this like creating a Seder meal, like that's a religious.
And he's leading prayer.
Yeah, I mean, and same with like like when I teach my kids about like Buddhism, we have like, I'll lead them in like a kind of meditation. And I think that we'd see that as like, oh, that's basically a moment of silence, and that's really okay.
I had parents
Seder
complain about
meals. What's that?
I had parents complain about the idea of practicing meditation when we study Buddhism.
Could you not just apply the opt-out here though?
Well, I think the rabbi is saying prayers and whatnot. The kids don't have to go along with it. I think this is part of, again, this idea of a lived religion. And I think if it's presented within the context of we eat this food because historically this is what happened with our people, and I think it could be part of a whole unit. And then other religions are given the opportunity to show a rite or a ceremony. But I think these kinds of things in which the students interact with people and feel what it's like to be for a minute.
But my concern is it Orthodox, is it Reformed, is it conservative? And it's not, that's not going to represent, you don't represent Judaism, it's representing a particular type. And the kids know that, do they have that background first? If not, I don't think it's a fair, and why did that rabbi get chosen? Is it representative?
Yeah, I definitely agree that that's also problematic, but if I'm reading this correctly, the rabbi has led the students in prayer in addition to, I mean, it isn't a rabbi saying, these are the components of the Seder meal, and this is what each part represents, and this is why traditionally this was important for the story, which to me would be more of what a field trip would be, right, where you're learning about the religion, but I think if it becomes the children engaging in that, that's a different scenario, I think.
And you feel like
Yeah,
that's
I would echo that. That's kind of where I was reading, to help lead the students. If they're just watching it, I agree. I think that that's fine, but to have them participate in that would be, I guess.
Well,
It seems though that in teaching about religion that there's something so fundamentally different than teaching about like math or teaching about, teaching like French. And that those are like not experiential things. What you're correct. Like I mean, just from my own, like, I did a master's in theology at Emory, and part of my education was kind of experiencing spirituality. And sometimes it was almost like an academic exercise. And I don't know, I sort of feel like this is, like, it's not okay to say this, but I wonder if that is like part of the duty of a teacher of religion, is to like make students feel something religious. Or that, like, this is how it feels to do or say this kind of prayer. Which, like, you can't do that with like math, but this is what it feels like to do.
Shakespeare or poetry.
Yeah, I think it's experiential. For me, I think I went to this school also, and I tried to experience many different things, but that was me as an adult making that choice. And I think sometimes when you're teaching, when you are teaching middle school, high school, there's a power dynamic, and the kids are a captive audience. And so that's where it gets a little tricky. And I know Henry and I talk about that with choosing the right panelists. Are you going to have someone who's going to take that opportunity of the captive audience to go a little bit farther than they should? And so, I don't know, I mean, Charlie, you comment on that. But that's where it feels a little tricky.
I would just say, I mean, obviously religion is a very personal experience, but I think as a teacher, our thing is to teach them. At least I see it as teaching about religion and not helping convert, or helping lead them into any particular experience, so that I would treat it more like this is what a Seder meal is, and these are the components, like more analytical, I guess, which might defeat kind of the whole idea of religion, but I think that would be different, like you'd be getting religious inspiration by attending as a single or a service, but I don't know, I just think it would be treading very difficult waters, I think that, so. And to make that distinction really clear to the kids so that there isn't confusion, because I think sometimes they don't get that, and they're following along and thinking you're promoting something.
Well, what's the difference between this and a site visit?
That's a really good question, yeah.
Well, on Sunday, we're going to experience a religious mass, or, I don't know all my.
Not a mass,
I'm
but
sorry.
we're going to church.
We're going to a service.
Yep.
That shows my background right there. And we're going to a service, which I personally would think would be great for the majority of my students, because I know that they have not experienced services in that kind of way. We're going to be going to a synagogue, we're going to the grotto, I mean, we're doing all these things. The only difference here is the rabbi is coming into your space. You're not going to another space.
But you won't be praying with them.
I do think it's one of the issues, and I'm not going to tip my hand as to how I think, in my personal opinion, this plays out at the different site visits. But one of the things that I want that we should all be kind of keeping track of in these field experiences is, to what extent are we being required to do something while we're there versus a very sort of up close, intimate observation. And that works differently in different houses of worship, in different types of experience. Like if we go, well, again, I don't want to I don't want to go into my own personal opinion of how that's going to play out in our different site visits. But, for me, just strictly personally, and I'm not the attorney on this, I would have a problem with the idea of the local rabbi coming into class and leading prayers. Like the rabbi coming into class and saying, here's a Seder plate, you want to try a little bit of matzah, there's all these kinds of experiential things that one can do up to the line of leading prayers for the students, and for me, the reason I treasure these sort of ethnographic site visits is that they're a great way to bring as much experiential richness as you can right up to, but not crossing that line of requiring religious practice. But we'll see. You're absolutely right, Kim, to point out that that's a fine line.
The key word here is lead.
Yeah.
Instead of share would be different.
Or demonstrate. Demonstrate. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to Corey. That's something you said earlier about
about the experience of those rituals or that practice being fundamental to religious understanding. I think it's actually maybe does the opposite, which is decontextualizing whatever is going on, like a Seder meal, and making it easily consumable rather than powerful or meaningful, placing it in its proper context, which is why maybe site visits might be better because those are actually in their natural context, whereas this one seems more like, oh, let's sample all of these religions and see what's good or cool,
Yeah.
something like that.
Can I say a couple more, then I'm gonna.
I was just gonna go with what Henry, I mean, kind of go along with what you were just saying is, to me, the difference on number one seems to be the rabbi coming into the classroom, which is, the place where students are used to sitting and learning different things, as opposed to going someplace else, that would be the place of worship or the normal environment where you would expect to see these things.
Yeah.
I think it also totally depends on the age group, and we'll talk more about this with the curriculum projects, but I would never take my middle school students to a service. Like, we did a lot of site visits, but I don't think they would have the maturity to handle what it means to observe in a setting like that. We would speak with religious leaders or lay people, we would see the spaces, but I don't think that it would be appropriate to bring sixth graders to an actual service. And I think that would be problematic for a variety of reasons.
I just think the litmus test has to be, is anything you're doing constituting practice? If it's practice, it can't happen in a public school. What'd you say?
Although, so when I was in graduate school at the University of California, Santa Cruz, also a public school, but a public college, right? We required students all the time to go do field work in local houses of worship, But that's also like, it's a public university requiring students for the completion of a course to go attend a religious service.
So Henry, do you feel like, and I really don't know, do you feel like a university where you have an option to attend or not is different from?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, so we'll start with that and work backwards a little bit. Just, you've raised all great issues. We could talk about this all day or night, because it's a huge topic. But really, all 3 weeks are going to be about these issues.
Yes, this is just like the beginning of a rich
beginning of the conversation, and you put on the floor all of the right issues. Wonderful discussion. But since I won't be here, I'll just make a few comments to wrap up my piece in terms of the constitutional pieces, at least. Starting with what Henry just said. The courts generally treat public universities very differently than K-12 settings. And the reason for that is, I think, what Mary Pat was saying earlier, the two factors: we have questionable young people and we have a captive audience. So the courts generally, the Supreme Court especially, including in the Schenck decision, has been has been very strict in applying the Establishment Clause, even including conservative justices. So the rule of thumb of neutrality under the Establishment Clause has been pretty consistent from the court right to left when it comes to a public school, whereas they're very different in other settings. They allow a lot more accommodation of religion, under government accommodation of religion, presence of religion in other settings than they would in the K-12 setting. So that's one thing to say. And I think that's fair enough in my view, because we do have impressionable young people who are there as a captive audience. And of course, in independent religious schools, it's a different question. You have more scope to teach religion, to whatever you want to do. But if you want to protect conscience of kids and of different faiths or no particular faith, then of course this is the spirit of the First Amendment, is to be careful about this. So you raised so many wonderful questions, but I think I'll just let you know that this has been an area of some litigation and some conflict along time. And generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that the best advice that the religious liberty world could give you, the consensus. I'm not speaking for myself, I'm speaking for the Christian Legal Society, the National Association of Evangelicals, the ACLU, People for the American Way, American Jewish Committee, so forth and so on. We've worked on these issues together. I think we generally, our consensus is generally no role playing in public schools of religious things. Religion is different. I think someone's talking about the difference. Religion is different than other things because of the establishment clause. So whereas role playing is a wonderful thing to do in history and other courses for people really, kids really getting involved, and I think role playing is fantastic. When it comes to religion, we advise against it on constitutional grounds because it's very difficult to do it without having students violating their conscience in ways that might be unanticipated or even unnoticed by the students themselves. Participating in a religion not their own in a public school setting is unconstitutional, and there's no hard line about role playing in a court decision, so we're not saying it's based on a particular court decision. There are, however, many court decisions that, specific court decisions that say that the government may not have students participate in religious practice that is organized or sponsored by or in any way led by the state. So teaching about religions, when it allows for students, or opens the door for students to participate in a religious practice, even if it's a pretend religious practice. Some religious practices you can't pretend without them also having a religious meaning. Some religious practices you can. You know, in the Catholic Mass, there's no way to pretend about the wafer and the water and the wine. There's no way to reenact that without, and some prayers and some practices or even movements carry spiritual significance even if they're done as reenactments. It still carries for some traditions. So it's a very difficult and complex world, obviously, but generally from the First Amendment perspective, we think it's not a world we want teachers to enter into in terms of classroom activities. Having said that, there are lots of things that might come right up to that and not be that. So I'm not saying it's all clear. There was a challenge in California to students dressing up, taking a Muslim name, dressing up as in a Muslim garb and doing reenactment. It was litigated, and the courts deferred to the school district. The school district actually won, even though the court said it might be inappropriate, but we're not going to tell the school district that they can't have this dressing up thing. So it might prevail. It was not appealed, so we don't know what an appeals court might do. I can tell you that there's going to be a lawsuit in a public school at some point if this happens at some point because it's happened over and over again. Yoga has been litigated, but as long as yoga is done in a way that has no connection to its religious roots, doesn't use even the language or terminology, Sanskrit words, it's just the physical exercises, is probably going to pass muster, but as soon as you get kids participating in yoga with any kind of sense that it is a religious activity, it is probably going to be struck down as unconstitutional. Participating, like the Schimpf decision, participating in any way, having the state lead people or put in an environment where people are participating in a religious exercise, the courts are going to take a very, very dim view of that. The other cluster of issues that you've raised in your comments, though, are the pedagogical and educational issues, which you're going to be exploring in more depth. That's beyond constitutional. It's related to it. But I think it's very difficult, as I think Jay was pointing if I remember your comments correctly, it's very difficult to reenact many religious rituals. Some religions it's easier than others and not undermine the authenticity. Some rituals lend themselves to that. Some religious leaders don't mind it. Others, just doing it challenges the authenticity. The teaching of Islam right now is, of course, the hot topic in many public schools. And we have multiple challenges going on about teaching Islam. for, I think, the wrong reasons. In other words, the challenges come because they want Islam to be taught as a violent, evil religion. Nothing less than that to satisfy them. In other words, if you're teaching about Islam, you ought to be teaching that it's the root of all its violence and so forth. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to teach about Islam according to how academic standards and scholarly work guides us. But these folks are looking for things schools are doing that they can latch on to and challenge. And one of the things is, yes, some of these, actually I think some of these teachers actually were not really well versed in teaching about Islam, so they were doing things like having the students memorize the Shahada and then come and recite it. Well, you know, that's when you become a Muslim.
That's a conversion ritual.
It's a conversion ritual. And would we have students memorize the Lord's Prayer, which is a central prayer reputedly given by Christ himself, and come in and memorize it and then stand up and recite the Lord's Prayer? We probably now know that that would not be an appropriate activity. But the Shahada, we don't kind of think about it that much, or some teachers don't, but they should. So some of it is, and then another, goes to one of these questions, another teacher had on the quiz, let's see if I get it right, the question that they were supposed to fill in the blank. Jews and Christians believe in the blank God as Muslims. And the correct answer is same. Well, no, it's not. Or maybe it is, but who's to say? And you know, it's that kind of simplistic thing that parents can listen. Because, you know, some people believe one thing, some people believe another, but at the very least, the understanding of God is quite different in those three traditions. And maybe that they all claim to have the full revelation of what that God requires, and that makes it a much more volatile question than if they all didn't trace themselves back to Abraham and believe they had the full revelation. Point being, how we ask these questions and how we teach about them, and that's not an example that's good for this group because you would never make that kind of mistake, but many teachers, this is in the rural South and Georgia, you know, they're just doing a quiz, fill in the blank, and they mean well, but they had a huge uproar in their community as a result. But the role-playing thing is a painful one because I love that opportunity for students. And, you know, just also when you get to the site visits and field trips, you know, I think those are fantastic opportunities. The only similarity I would draw between the two is to what extent are students participating in a religious activity. To that extent, I think I agree with Kathy. I think to that extent it's probably unconstitutional to have them participate. Does that mean observing is out? Maybe not. Again, no bright lines here because we don't have all these Supreme Court decisions saying this is where you draw the line. But I think that we have a lot of red flags and lower court decisions and Supreme Court decisions to say, just at the very least, we have to be very, very careful that public schools do not in any way have students engaging in religious activity or anti-religious activity, for that matter. Either way, it's showing a video of a worship service, things like that, no problem whatsoever with the First Amendment. The only problems come when people actually are participating and doing something, as in a religious ritual or ceremony. I think it's highly problematic. But I will say again, no bright lines here, and this is something you all have to struggle with and think about. There are so many ways to do what you all want to do, and that's why you're here. So many exciting, wonderful ways to bring religions alive that are within the First Amendment. I will also say this as a last word from me at least, that we spent a lot of time this afternoon talking about the vision of the First Amendment, no establishment, free exercise, and how that works in a public school. So I want to come back at the end and say, you know, some years ago, we got together, again, evangelicals, Catholics, Jewish groups, everybody. We got together, and we spent a year and a half trying to come up with shared language and what the First Amendment looks like in public schools. So in my section, with what we came up with, I should have brought the Teacher's Guide to Religion in public schools. I didn't.
They have it.
Okay.
We're reading it.
So you'll see it.
It's in
You'll
there.
see it at the beginning, because every guide I do, I quote it pretty often.
They have that, and they have the AAR guide.
So we spent a year and a half, and we have 10 principles, shared vision, but the one that was the hardest is this one. I think it's number 4. Again, you have to remember, Christian Coalition signed this. People for the American Way. I mean, these are people who litigate against one another. So getting shared language is very difficult. But here's what it is. Under the First Amendment, public schools may not inculcate nor inhibit religion. They must be places where religion and religious conviction are treated with fairness and respect. Public schools uphold the First Amendment when they protect the religious liberty rights of students of all faiths or none. Schools demonstrate fairness when they ensure that the curriculum includes study about religion, where appropriate, as an important part of a complete education. We all agree on this language. Doesn't mean we all agree on how it's applied, but actually, in many cases, we do. We agree about the ground rules for teaching about religion. We agree that students may pray alone or in groups as long as they don't interfere with the rights of others. We agree that under the Equal Access Act, they may form religious clubs in a public school, as long as the school allows other secondary schools, as long as they allow others to go to clubs. They can share their faith with their classmates, again, as long as they don't disrupt. They can speak about their faith in a class discussion or a class assignment. In fact, they're protected to do so. If it's germane to the assignment, they can't be told, they can't say what they believe. There's a long list of ways in which religious expression is protected under the First Amendment in public schools. And religion itself, the role of religion is under the Establishment Clause, if not required, at least protected to be ensured. So those who say that public schools, and we're just talking about public schools here, are hostile to religion, or the First Amendment makes them hostile, it's just not true. In public schools today, there's probably more student religious expression than there has been in the last 100 years. And there's also more teaching about religions today in public schools than there has been probably in our history. Because what we did in the 19th century was not teaching about religion, it was teaching religion. When it did appear in religion. So at the end of this session, I just want you to take away that the First Amendment is about fairness. It is about letting the voices be heard. It is about inclusion. It isn't about keeping out, excluding, shutting people up. If I didn't pay attention to you when you asked or made your wonderful comments, you wouldn't go away from here saying Charles was neutral toward us. If I ignored you, you would say he was hostile. He just ignored us. So ignoring religion is not neutrality. Silence about religion is not neutrality. Teaching about religion is a way to actually accomplish what the First Amendment requires, which is fairness, letting those voices in the curriculum. The great thing about this institute, one of the many great things, is that you're not just teaching about religion in your various ways, but this institute helps you to do it in a way that actually is serious. And it may take some risks, may walk up to some lines, great. Because unless we do that in education, we're cheating our kids. So I am really excited for you, because I think if you go back and bring religions alive in the ways that you're going to explore here, in the ways that you want to do in your classrooms, you will be living up to the First Amendment and carrying it forward. There's really no future for freedom of conscience in this country, except through what you're doing in the classroom. And that's just the truth. That's not being nice to you. That's just the truth. Lawyers and judges are the future of the First Amendment. We're in big trouble. We need lawyers and judges. And litigation is our, do you thought baseball is our national pastime? It's litigation. And it's tearing us apart. and it is really undermining education. So that is not the answer to liberty of conscience in this country, and protecting it and expanding it to these, all the folks who've not been fully protected. It's a huge task, and it's all going to depend on what you're doing. Schools are the place where we either learn about liberty of conscience, learn how to live out these protections, learn how to live out this arrangement, or we don't. So that's a way at the end to thank you for what you're doing. So much enjoyed being, I know you're going to have a great 3 weeks. Thank you.
And also, thank you for your incredible energy and enthusiasm over a long day.